Okay. So today we have only one speaker, and we have our own Rebecca Nevin, who is a postdoc here at the CfA. She graduated from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and she studies the kinematics of galaxies and AGN. And she has a great YouTube channel where she posts videos about science and also what scientists do when they leave astronomy. And she has great plans to expand the videos on her YouTube channel. So I think, I'm looking forward to seeing what she's going to do. And today she's going to talk about how to use stellar kinematics to identify galaxy mergers. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Sirio. I guess this basically forces me to expand my YouTube channel now that you're holding me accountable for it. Thanks. Yes, but we're not talking about YouTube. We're talking about identifying mergers. And I specifically would like to focus on the stellar kinematic aspect of this today. So not just on how do we identify mergers using stellar kinematics, but what can stellar kinematics actually tell us about merging galaxies? What can we get out of them physically as well? Okay, so I'm showing you here, this is a snapshot from a simulation of a merging galaxy. So these are panels of a mock observation of a merging galaxy. If you want to know more about the imaging side of this approach, which I've previously developed, you can check out my 2019 paper. So what I did there was I created mock Sloan images, R-band images, and use them to create a classification technique. But today I want to explicitly and only focus on the stellar kinematic side of the approach. So here I'm showing you what I call MaNGA-ized stellar velocity and stellar velocity dispersion maps. They are MaNGA-ized because they match the specifications of the Mapping Nearby Galaxies at Apache Point IFS survey. And this is a Sloan 4 survey of more than 10,000 galaxies. And so you can imagine why I might want to create mock MaNGA images, because this is such a powerful statistical set of more than 10,000 galaxies that I can then go and identify using this technique. That's the end goal. And I recently finished this up. You can check out the paper on the archive. Okay, so I'm going to try to highlight the main questions I have for myself and for the field in yellow, and I will try my best to address most of these questions, but no promises. Okay, so why identify merging galaxies? Well, I think we could all agree that it's pretty clear from some pretty dramatic examples of local mergers that merging galaxies can be really transformative in terms of galaxy evolution. So for example, this is NGC 6240. This is a local major merger, and major mergers are when the mass ratio of the two merging galaxies is roughly equal. These are the most dramatic kind of mergers. This galaxy I've worked on with Francisco Mueller-Sanchez to characterize the kinematics of both a star formation-driven outflow and an AGN-driven outflow. So there's a lot happening with the gas in this galaxy as a result of a merger. Great, fine. But I think what we like to do as a field is actually take a step back and ask the question, okay, well, overall, how important are galaxy mergers to driving galaxy evolution? And I think the answer to this is a bit hazy. I think you really need to get into the details of what types of mergers are you talking about. So for example, we just looked at this galaxy, which is a major merger. However, there's a lot more minor mergers out there. They're just harder to identify, and they can also be really important for galaxy evolution. Additionally, galaxy mergers take billions of years to complete. And so for example, here I'm showing you a sequence of different stages of a galaxy merger. And this picture gets a lot more complicated when you start really digging into, okay, well, what happens at the different stages of a merger? So for example, I want to dig a little bit more into this with this diagram. Okay, so the first thing that can happen is the close pairs phase. And what this is the galaxies have begun to interact. These can be identified using spectroscopic studies. And so some would argue that this is a pretty easy stage to identify. However, not much is happening evolutionarily in this stage. Recent studies have shown that there's not that much triggered star formation yet. If we move, oops, wrong direction. If we move on to the next few stages, the interacting and the coalescence phase, you can see visibly in these images that there's a lot of star formation happening in the tidal tails of this galaxy. So star formation can be extended. It can also occur in the center of the galaxy in the case of NGC 6240. And so this question of where are these evolutionary processes happening, when are they happening, becomes a lot more nuanced, and you have to break it down by stage. Finally, I really want to highlight this last stage of the merger, the post-merger stage. I'm showing you an example of a post-starburst galaxy, which is believed to be one type of post-merger galaxy. And what happens here is that these are galaxies that have dramatically and recently shut down their star formation. If you want to know more, you can check out Decker-French's work on the subject. And my point here is that post-mergers are actually pretty difficult to identify in imaging, but they can be really important evolutionarily, shown by this type of post-starburst galaxy. And so with kinematics, one of the main goals of the project is actually to be able to identify this stage of galaxy using stellar kinematics. Okay, so to just sum up everything I've already said, my goal is to identify a diversity of different types of galaxy mergers. And this would include things like different stages of the merger and get really detailed with that. And also maybe think about major versus minor mergers. Okay, so how to do this? Here is my really stretched analogy for how this works in practice. Okay, so let's imagine we all live in Boston. I think most of us probably do. And you need to move to Boston, you need to get an apartment. Okay, so like with anything, there are different tools that you can use to find apartments. And when I first moved here, I was bombarded by these luxury apartment ads. These I think of as the major mergers of the apartment world. They're very bright, they're very beautiful, they're very expensive. There's not that many of them. And so I can't afford this type of apartment. Instead, I'm going to go to a different search engine because what you're using matters. I'm going to use Zillow. And here I am searching between 1K and 2K for apartments in Somerville. And if any of you live in Somerville, you might know that these are all ridiculously inexpensive. So for example, this top left one, it looks like it has a modern kitchen and it's 4,000 square feet. That is huge. And it's only $1,000 a month. This is a definite false positive of this detection algorithm. Okay, so it's important to characterize that and know what your false positives might be from your tool. Likewise, I'm in an apartment right now that was not listed on Zillow. This was a Craigslist apartment. So for me, this would be a false negative of Zillow. So I only needed to find one apartment that worked like well enough for me. But with Galaxy mergers, I would like to get the lay of the land a little bit more and understand the algorithm overall. So that would be like going to work for Zillow for a number of years and really get behind the scenes and understand what the algorithm is missing and why. But my approach for Galaxy mergers is a little bit different than that. Instead, what I'm doing is using simulations to create the merger identification tool and then use those same simulations to really understand what are its pitfalls, what are its strengths, and what can we expect when we apply it to real galaxies. Okay, so these simulations are by Laura Blecka, and I have a suite of 5 in-body smooth particle hydrodynamics simulations with radiative transfer. I think the main thing to know about these is that they have relative disadvantages and advantages. A disadvantage would be these are only 5 different mergers, so we don't have the full range of cosmological parameters you would get from a Cosmo simulation. Instead, I would think about these galaxies as disk-dominated intermediate mass galaxies. An advantage, a relative advantage, however, is that we have really high time and spatial resolution. And so we can look at different stages and look in detail at these mergers from 7 different viewing angles. Okay, so I'm going to simplify this just a little bit for today. There are 5 different simulations. I'm going to group them into the major merger combined category and the minor merger combined category. These are the mass ratios of these mergers. And I'm going to talk mostly about just the combined categories in order to broadly compare the results. Okay, to break down these simulations, we have a training set of merging and non-merging snapshots. I'm going to color code these. Merging are the salmon colors. And so here I'm showing you 3 different stages of a major merger. This is where the mass ratio is 1:2 or 0.5, and the gas fraction is 0.3. This is the most major merger, the majorest of major mergers we have from the suite of 5 simulations. And so I'm showing you the time progression along the bottom. Again, these last for billions of years. And these 3 snapshots are merging. That's my label for them. Then I have a set of non-merging galaxies, and I take these to be snapshots that occur before first pericentric passage. Those are non-merging. And snapshots that occur more than half a gigayear after coalescence. Those are also the post-merger or non-merging. And finally, there's a matched set of isolated non-merging galaxies that are matched to the initial conditions of the beginning of the merger. Okay, so that's the most major merger. Here, just visibly to get a sense of this, this is the most minor merger where the mass ratio is 1:10. And you can see that it's a lot harder just by eye to identify this as a merger. Okay, so that is the set of merging and non-merging galaxies that I'm going to use to create a classification technique. But we're looking at imaging, so I really want to get into the stellar kinematics of this. So this technique included a lot of work to create mock realistic stellar kinematic maps that match MaNGA specifications. So usually what people will do is take the particle velocities from a simulation and create maybe a hexagonal mask that looks like MaNGA. Instead, what I'm doing is following the MaNGA data analysis pipeline to create mock observations. So you can think of this as coming down to working with spectra. We are simulating spectra using radiative transfer and then doing all sorts of convolution rebitting. And additionally, and then the final step is to fit the absorption lines using PPXF. So we're doing this much like you would do for observed data. And if you want to know more about this, please set up a meeting with me because I can talk about this in excruciating detail. But I won't now. Okay, it's time for our interactive activity. So what I'm going to have everybody do is vote on whether they think these galaxies are mergers or non-mergers using your reactions button, which is along the bottom toolbar. And I want you to tell me for this galaxy on the left, do you think this is a merger or a non-merger based on its velocity and velocity dispersion map? Okay, I hope my guest reactions are going to match what people think. I'm seeing 3 mergers, 3 non-mergers. I think I matched you. Oh, we're half and half. Okay, well, I said this was a merger. So we'll go with that for now. Now let's up the ante. I'm going to have you vote on first this left bottom galaxy. Do you think this is a merger? Lots of crying, laughing faces. Oh, wow. Okay, yeah, I agree. Probably not by eye. Okay, what about this bottom right example? Oh man, I changed what I said for this. Okay. Well, I put both because people have guessed ambiguously in the past, but we could pretend that's a heart there. Okay, I want everybody to stay on the edge of your seat because we will come back to this. Okay, so my whole task with this project was how do we do this non-qualitatively, which is what we just did. How do we actually quantify these kinematic maps and create an algorithm that can measure things from these kinematic maps to identify them as mergers for us? Because after all, I'd like to eventually do this on 10,000 galaxies. And I don't want to look at them all myself. So I'm measuring a number of kinematic predictors from these maps. These are all sorts of historical things people have used to identify mergers via their stellar kinematics in the past. I've also created some new ones based on what I've seen that has been helpful. And so you might recognize some of these. Delta PA is the difference between the kinematic and the imaging position angle. I use kinemetry to model these as axisymmetric rotating disks and then calculate the deviation from that. And then I think specific angular momentum is a pretty common tool for quantifying kinematics in this way. And then I did want to talk about, I'm using the moments of the velocity and the velocity dispersion distribution to quantify kinematic disturbance. And so what this is I'm basically taking the velocity dispersion map here, and I'm taking the value from all the different spaxels and putting it into a histogram form. And then from this histogram, I'm measuring the mean, the standard deviation, the skewness, and the kurtosis. And these are all individual kinematic predictors. So the next step is to combine all of these kinematic predictors into one classification tool known as linear discriminant analysis. And I want you to think about this like a logistic regression. Basically, you have a population of merging and non-merging galaxies, but imagine this is a hyperdimensional space. And what you're trying to do is solve for a hyperplane that best separates these two populations in this space, where each axis of the space is a kinematic predictor. Okay, so the solution to this is known as linear discriminant axis 1, or LD1. And it looks like this for the major merger population. Mergers are in salmon or pink, and non-mergers are teal. And this LD1 does a pretty good job of separating the mergers from the non-mergers here. Again, this LD1, I'm writing it out here explicitly, is a linear combination of all these input terms and some cross terms as well. And I think this is a little bit overwhelming, but I think what it goes to show is that this is not a black box. What you can actually do is dig into these classifications and learn a lot about which kinematic predictors are most informative for different merger simulations for identifying mergers, which I'll do in a little bit. Okay, but first, what did the LDA say about all of these examples? So here's the moment we've all been waiting for. It says these are all mergers. And I've explicitly picked 3 examples to make a number of points here. It doesn't just classify everything as mergers, don't worry. So this upper left one is very disturbed by I. We would agree with that, probably agree with the LDA classification. This bottom left one, to me, looks by eye like a disk, so it doesn't look like a merger. What's happening here is the LDA is picking up on some more subtle kinematic features that are able to identify this stage as merging. This is during the early stages of the merger, so the galaxies have just begun to interact. And this, the LDA agreed with you all here, saying this is a merger, but we're all wrong. This is not a merger. This is actually a post-merger stage after the merger has completed, when the stellar kinematics are still disturbed by I and according to the LDA. And so I'll talk more about why this mistake is made here. Okay, first digging into how this classification varies with mass ratio. The major mergers are more accurate in this classification, and we can dig into why that is. It turns out that when I look at the predictors that are most important for these different classifications, the major mergers really tend to rely on kinematic predictors that track these global long-term kinematic features. So for example, here I'm showing you an example of a stellar bulge in a merger remnant from a major merger. The major mergers really build up the stellar bulge component, which manifests as various kinematic predictors related to the stellar velocity dispersion map. The minor mergers, on the other hand, are sensitive to these more short-term features. So for example, here, this is when there's a galaxy up here on the top part of this bottom map and a galaxy in the center, and they're just coming in to merge, and you see this bridge-like feature in the velocity dispersion map because you're seeing 2 overlapping stellar disks. This is a shorter term feature, and that is perhaps part of the reason that this, the minor mergers are not as well identified. Okay. I think a main takeaway from this technique is that you can look at how the classification varies with time. And then 2 main takeaways here are that the pre-coalescence mergers are very disky, both by eye, as we saw, and according to the classification. So I showed you an example of where the LDA was correct. It was able to correctly identify this as merging. But in a lot of cases, it misses these early stage mergers. And that's because the imaging features may look more disturbed at this stage. You have these more dramatic tidal tails, but the IFS field of view is much smaller and the stellar kinematics are not yet disturbed. Whereas on the other hand, the post-coalescence mergers have these long-lived features in the stellar kinematics. Whereas in the imaging, the imaging features have faded at this point. The stellar kinematics still have these warps and this enhancement in the velocity dispersion map. And so this brings up a really philosophical question, which is, when does a merger end? I think the answer would be different if you used imaging versus kinematic features. Okay, so I've already created the imaging classification, and now I can directly compare the two since they're created using the same set of simulations. It turns out the imaging is slightly more accurate, has an 88% accuracy. So you might ask, well, what does the kinematic classification even add to the imaging classification? It's what I just said. The kinematic classification is better at finding these post-coalescence mergers, and that's important because that means these two are complementary. Okay, so moving forward, just to briefly tell you what I plan to do with these classifications in the future. I am in the process of applying the imaging classification to all of Sloan DR12 imaging. So I've been running like 50,000 galaxies through my little computer. And the next step is to apply the stellar kinematic side of things to MaNGA as well. So I have both classifications for a number of galaxies. And this is down here, I'm showing you an example of doing this where you would measure all the stellar kinematic predictors and the imaging predictors and place the galaxy somewhere on this axis. And I didn't mention this before, but each galaxy is then assigned a probability of merging. So this is a non-binary classification. And then the additional step is to further split by merger stage, because I've been talking a lot about the differences between pre-coalescence, post-coalescence mergers and how important it is to do this. And I can do that since I have detailed time information. The final step is to build off of current work that has looked at things like star formation rate trends with radius for larger samples of mergers than those that can be identified by eye in the past. And so I've been working with Xian Pan on this. So she's been doing work with a sample of about 4,000 MaNGA galaxies, for which she's gone through and visibly identified all these different stages of the merger, and has been looking at the star formation rate trend with radius. So just to highlight one aspect of this work, this red line is for the stages before first pericentric passage. And it's a flat gradient with radius that shows no enhancement of star formation rate. And so it's important to look with radius and also splitting up these samples by stage. And I'm hoping that my classification technique will really ease this work, because she's been mentioning that it's very difficult to do this by eye, and build upon what's already been done here. Okay, and I'll just conclude by showing you the three main takeaways here. First, I created a bunch of mock MaNGA images to match the specifications of the survey. Then I learned that the kinematic technique is complementary. It adds information about the post-coalescence stages of the merger. And then I talked about the next steps of applying this classification technique to Sloan imaging and MaNGA IFS. Thank you.
Thank you for a really nice, very clear talk. We have time for a few questions. Brian?
Hello. I'm wondering if you noticed any differences between whether kinematics or imaging was better for like gas-rich to gas-poor mergers, and whether the difference between gas-rich and gas-poor mergers makes either one of the detection techniques better or worse, and what you might expect if you did do that kind of study.
Yes, gas fraction is not something I talked about at all. I always have to leave out a bunch of stuff. So I hesitate to say much because we only had one of the 5 simulations that had a different gas fraction. So I don't think we can really probe that space. But I can say, just based on that one simulation, that in the stellar kinematics, there wasn't a huge difference. Also, there wasn't a huge difference in imaging. What was I going to add? Oh, I was going to add that aside of this, another approach to this that hasn't been done is using the gas kinematics to identify mergers. And I wonder if the gas kinematics would really be more different between different gas fractions, whereas the stellar kinematics are more agnostic to that. I do talk about this a little bit in the papers if you wanted to look at that.
Thanks.
Other questions? Well, I do have a follow-up question to that, which is that particularly when thinking about the gas kinematics, it would be very interesting to apply this technique, all these formalism to high redshift observations. But there's a, sort of a debate on how much can you really tell from high redshift kinematics, because of course they have lower signal to noise and you have less spaxels. It would be interesting to just, even without actually using any data, to just see what kind of signal to noise and spatial resolution you would need to be able to tell the different stages of mergers.
Yeah, that is a difficult question. I think, remember when Raymond Simmons came to talk? He does this kind of simulation for gas of high redshift galaxies. And his main concern is like being able to tell close pairs from like a disk. So that would be like just that one stage of the merger. So it's like a much more difficult problem because you're right, the spatial resolution is not there. I would add that like one thing I tried to do was push this suite of simulations to high redshift and see just how high redshift it went, how well it worked at higher redshift, and it definitely does not push to that high of redshift. I think maybe at like a Z of 0.1 or something, it was not effective. Then again, like this is the MaNGA survey, so it's specifically designed for like very local galaxies. But I think if somebody wanted to do gas kinematics, because you wouldn't be able to do stellar kinematics for a number of higher redshift galaxies, that would be an interesting direction to take this kind of work. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so let's thank Becky again. And for today, that's it. See you all next week.